The air inside the cabin of Liberty Airways Flight 3276 was thick with that familiar hum of pre-flight chaos. Carry-ons being stuffed into overhead bins, jackets being shrugged off, passengers murmuring about delays. But in row 16, something different stirred. Julian Harris and his younger sister Tiana stepped into the aisle with the quiet ease of people who had nothing to prove and everything to celebrate. Julian had just made partner at his architecture firm in Chicago. Tiana, freshly offered the position of director at Howard University's new Center for Racial Equity, was beaming with an energy too genuine to hide. They were heading to Charlotte to celebrate their parents' 50th wedding anniversary, and everything about their mood reflected that kind of earned joy. Tiana teased her brother about his overstuffed briefcase. Julian, in return, mocked her carefully rolled research posters. The two laughed softly as they reached their seats, middle and window, and took their places with the practiced grace of seasoned travelers. For a brief moment they were just two siblings, relaxed and glowing on a long overdue family trip. But the peace didn't last. A sharp voice cracked through the cabin like thunder. "You people need to control your children." The sound cut through the chatter, and every head turned forward. Julian looked up, frowning. Tiana twisted in her seat to see. Up near row 6, a white flight attendant, Linda Morgan, early 50s, stiff posture, blonde bun pulled tight as a drum, was leaning over a young black mother and her little boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old. A juice box lay crushed underfoot, its contents splattered across the aisle. The boy clutched a threadbare fleece blanket, his eyes wide with fear, his lip trembling. The mother held her hand up, trying to calm the situation. Her voice shook. "He's just a little boy. He didn't mean to spill." But Linda didn't let her finish. With a swift motion that no one in the cabin could have expected or ever forget, she raised her hand and slapped the child across the cheek. The sound of the strike echoed like gunfire in a church. The cabin fell into a stunned, sick silence. Julian shot out of his seat. Tiana was already moving forward, her heels clicking furiously down the aisle. "Did you just strike that child?" she shouted. Loud and clear. Linda froze. Her expression flickered. Shock, maybe fear, but then she quickly reset her face. "He was being unruly," she snapped. "That's a child," Tiana said, her voice tight with fury. "You just assaulted a child." Julian was calm, but his jaw was clenched. He had his phone in hand already, camera pointed down as he hit record. "I need to report a violent incident involving your flight crew," he said into the speaker. Passengers around them stared, some whispering, others just holding their breath. And then, as if summoned by the scent of chaos, a new presence swept into the aisle. Rebecca Langford. She was in her 60s, dressed in an immaculate cream blazer, expensive pearls around her neck, and a look on her face like she'd just been forced to walk through a construction site. She didn't look at the child. She didn't even glance at the mother. Her attention went straight to Julian and Tiana. "Excuse me," she said sharply, cutting past people. "I need to sit with my husband. These people need to move." Linda turned on her heel like a loyal soldier, instantly redirecting her energy. "We're trying to accommodate a platinum member," she explained to Julian and Tiana. "Would you mind relocating to row 28 so Ms. Langford can sit with her husband?" Julian blinked. "We booked these seats together," he said calmly. "We're not moving." Rebecca didn't flinch, her voice carried down the aisle. "I shouldn't be stuck in the back because these people won't cooperate." A silence heavier than the one before blanketed the cabin. Tiana, eyes locked on Rebecca, spoke with deadly precision. "What people exactly, Ms. Langford?" The words hung in the air like glass suspended mid-shatter. Linda's smile faltered, but she doubled down. "Sir, ma'am, I'm going to ask you again." "No," Julian said. "I'd like to speak with the captain." I'm afraid he's unavailable during takeoff prep. I'll wait. Tiana crossed her arms. You're escalating something that started with you slapping a little boy. That was when it happened. A man slowly rose from row 28. He was tall, white, maybe 70, wearing a faded navy blazer with fraying elbow patches. He didn't speak right away, just looked from Linda to Rebecca, then to Julian and Tiana. I'll switch with them, he said at last. No one should be forced to move. Especially not after what we just witnessed. His name was Walter McKinley, and in that moment, he shifted the tone of the entire plane. Rebecca rolled her eyes, but said nothing. Linda stepped back, face flushed. Julian gave Walter a slow nod of gratitude. Tiana whispered, "Thank you," before returning to her seat beside her brother. As Walter settled into row 16, the atmosphere remained fragile. Passengers looked away, looked down, pretended not to feel what was still burning in the air. Linda disappeared to the front galley, but the damage had been done. The slap, the entitlement, the racism disguised as policy, it all hung in the air with nowhere to go. Julian sat back, arms folded across his chest, heart thudding but steady. Tiana leaned slightly toward her brother and whispered, "This isn't over." He nodded, and it wasn't. The hush that fell over Flight 3276 after the slap still lingered like smoke. Passengers had returned to their seats, eyes averted, ears perked. People went back to pretending nothing had happened, but the weight of what they'd seen hung heavy in the recycled cabin air. Julian Harris sat straighter now, arms folded, his phone still recording in his lap. His sister Tiana glanced around carefully, her mind already analyzing patterns, power, silence. Sitting beside them in row 16 was Walter McKinley, who had switched seats just moments earlier in what felt like the only act of decency since takeoff. Walter adjusted his seatbelt with slow hands. He looked over at Julian, then at Tiana, and gave a nod that felt like an invitation. "I marched with Dr. King," Walter said, voice quiet but sure. "Montgomery, Selma, the Poor People's Campaign. I practiced civil rights law in the 70s. Lost more than I won, but kept showing up." Julian didn't speak right away, but something eased in his jaw. Tiana's face softened. "That explains a lot," she said, her tone warm, surprised, moved. Walter smiled, not proud, but reflective. "I've seen what silence does. Figured it was time to be loud again." Julian gave a short nod. "Well, thank you." Most people would have just looked away. Walter sighed. "I've done that too. Not proud of those times." The moment felt like a small shelter, a pause of kindness in a storm of cruelty. For a brief while, the row felt safe. The hum of the engines returned to background noise. Tiana leaned back in her seat, not relaxing, but reassessing. And then Linda came back. The smile was gone. Her face was tight, her tone clipped, professional in the way some people use professionalism to hide hostility. "Mr. Langford," she began loudly, projecting for the nearby rows to hear, "has graciously agreed to give up his first-class seat to be with his wife." She didn't look at Julian or Tiana, but the next words were clearly aimed at them. "Since we'll need 2 seats together now, I'm asking you again." Tiana raised her hand. "Let me guess, you need us to move." Linda's voice sharpened. "It's about creating a comfortable experience for all our passengers." Julian spoke this time, his tone even but stone cold. "You mean the white ones?" There was a long pause. Nearby passengers started turning their heads again. Demeanor didn't blink. "You're targeting us. You've already asked once. We've already said no." Linda hesitated, just for a second. Her eyes shifted. She wasn't used to resistance. That was when another figure appeared. Ariel Thomas, a young black flight attendant with a name tag tilted slightly to the side. She stepped forward slowly, standing just behind Linda, arms at her sides, eyes scanning the row. She didn't say anything, but her face said plenty. She looked at Julian, at Tiana, at the child who'd been slapped earlier and was now curled under his mother's arm in row 6, cheeks streaked with dried tears. Then she looked at Linda and froze. Linda pressed on. "If we can't resolve this, we'll have to bring in the captain." Walter stood up again, slower this time but taller somehow. "No," he said. "What you're going to do is stop this flight and bring him here. Because this, what you're doing, this is discrimination." Linda faltered, her mouth opened, then closed. "I am a retired civil rights attorney," Walter continued, louder now. "And this is not okay. This is coercion based on race, wrapped in airline policy, and I promise you, I still know how to file a complaint." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the cabin. Linda took a step back. Her hands twitched at her sides. Ariel spoke, her voice small but steady. "I'll get the captain." She left in a hurry, leaving Linda standing alone under a dozen pairs of eyes. She glanced around the cabin, then down at the floor, then toward the galley, as if she might disappear into it. Tiana sat perfectly still, but her pulse thundered in her ears. Julian placed his phone back on his tray, screen still glowing. He looked at Walter, then at his sister, and nodded once. They were ready. Minutes later, the curtain at the front of the cabin rustled, and Captain Marcus Bennett stepped through. He was tall, African-American, maybe early 50s, with salt and pepper hair and the calm presence of someone used to turbulence, on the ground and in the air. He approached row 16, flanked by Ariel. "I understand there's a situation here," he said. "I'd like to hear directly from you." Julian stood. Tiana stayed seated, back straight, arms folded. Julian spoke first. "We were asked to give up our seats, twice. Once for a passenger who insulted us, then again for her husband. After we'd already refused, after your attendant assaulted a child." Captain Bennett nodded. "I see." That's Walter spoke next. "I witnessed it all, including the slap, including the pressure. I switched seats to stop the conflict, and they still weren't left alone." Captain Bennett looked at Tiana. "Ma'am," she looked him dead in the eye. "This isn't about seats. It's about who gets to feel like they belong, and who gets asked to prove they deserve it." The captain stood still for a beat. Then he turned, eyes sweeping the cabin, the silence once again oppressive. "No one on this plane will be discriminated against under my command," he said. The sentence landed like a gavel. "I'll be speaking with my crew," he continued. "But for now, these passengers will stay in their seats. Everyone else will adjust accordingly." Linda didn't speak. She turned and walked away, fast. Ariel gave a subtle nod to Tiana. It wasn't much, but it was real. Julian sat back down, Walter followed. Tiana exhaled, a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. And then the cabin finally exhaled with them. The cabin of Flight 3276 had gone eerily quiet again. After the commanding presence of Captain Bennett and the clear decision that Julian and Tiana would not be moved, passengers resumed their postures like actors waiting for a curtain to fall. But the energy had shifted. The threat had passed, but the tension was still there, humming low, pulsing through the recycled air. Rebecca Langford sat rigid beside Julian, her posture perfect and stiff, her pearl earrings barely moving as she clutched her handbag in her lap. Her knuckles were white. She didn't look at him, not even a glance. Her lips were pressed tight, her eyes focused straight ahead, like she could will herself into another row, another plane, another world. The weight of her lost privilege sat heavier than her carry-on. Tiana watched all of it with a measured eye. The tension between her brother and this woman was thicker than cabin air at 30,000 feet, but Tiana wasn't one to let tension sit. She leaned slightly forward and smiled with practiced ease. "Your ring is beautiful," she said, her voice soft but sure. "Is it vintage?" The line landed like a pebble in still water. Rebecca blinked, startled. It took a moment for her to register that the woman she'd helped humiliate was now offering her a compliment. She hesitated, then lifted her left hand slightly, fingers trembling just a bit. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "It was my grandmother's. She wore it every day of her marriage." There was something fragile in the way she said it. For the first time since she boarded, Rebecca looked less like a privileged woman in pearls, and more like someone holding on to something that had meaning, that had roots. It cracked the edge of the mask she'd worn all flight. Julian noticed it too. He didn't interrupt, but instead reached into his backpack and pulled out a well-worn copy of The Warmth of Other Suns. He didn't flash it like a statement. He just held it gently in his hand, thumb running along the edge of the cover. "Tiana gave me this last Christmas," he said casually. "Helped me understand what my grandparents went through coming up from Mississippi. It changed the way I saw everything." Rebecca turned her head just enough to see the title. Her expression shifted, the recognition quiet but clear. "My book club started that one last year," she said softly. "I didn't finish it. It was longer than I expected." Julian didn't flinch, didn't judge. He smiled slightly. "It's heavy," he said, "but worth it." For a second, Rebecca's guard faltered. She nodded. It wasn't much, but it was more than silence. It was human. Tiana leaned back and asked, "Did you grow up in Boston?" Rebecca gave a short laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Close enough. A town called Marlborough. New England through and through. Red bricks, church bells. Everyone knew everyone." Her voice grew distant, reflective. "We didn't have neighbors who looked like you." Julian let that hang in the air. Not confrontational, just honest. Rebecca sighed. "I guess I've lived in a bit of a bubble." There it was. Not an apology, not redemption, but awareness. That tiny glimmer of self-awareness breaking through decades of conditioning. It wasn't everything, but it was something. Tiana tilted her head, letting the silence do the work. Sometimes, it wasn't about saying more. It was about letting someone else hear their own words echo. Julian didn't push either. He flipped through the pages of the book, not to read but to occupy his hands, to let the space stay calm. Rebecca finally looked at him. Really looked. For the first time since she boarded, her gaze didn't come with expectation or judgment. Just curiosity. "I didn't mean to come across the way I did," she said. Julian didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Sometimes silence was louder than speech. Tiana spoke instead. "It's not about how you came across, it's about how you made someone feel." Rebecca looked down. Her fingers fidgeted with her ring again. "Well," she said, her voice tight but not cold. "It's a beautiful book. Maybe I'll give it another try." "You should," Julian said. The conversation tapered off after that, but something had shifted. Not resolved, not redeemed, but shifted. The hostility was still there, but the edges were duller now. The sharpness replaced by something a little softer, a little less sure of itself. To anyone else watching, it might have seemed like nothing. Just three strangers in row 16, sitting quietly on a late afternoon flight. But for Julian, Tiana, and yes, even Rebecca, it felt like something had cracked open. A window, maybe. Small, but real. The plane had reached a quiet lull. Overhead lights dimmed, window shades half drawn, and passengers tucked into novels, earbuds, or light naps. The earlier chaos had settled into a fragile stillness, like a surface of water smoothed by time. But in row 16, something more subtle had begun to shift. Something quieter than conflict, but more lasting. Walter McKinley reappeared with the kind of gentle timing that seemed deliberate. He held his phone in one hand, pride glowing on his face. "I just got a few new photos of my great-granddaughter," he said, his voice a low rumble that didn't disturb the quiet, but slipped into it naturally. "Mind if I show you?" Julian looked up first, offering an easy smile. Tiana leaned in, already softening, drawn to the warmth Walter carried. Rebecca, seated closest to the aisle, hesitated. Then she shifted just enough to see the screen. That tiny motion was more than politeness. It was interest, a kind of thaw. The photo showed a baby girl wrapped in a quilt, eyes wide and wondering. Walter beamed. "Sophia Elizabeth, born last week, named after my late wife." Tiana smiled. "She's gorgeous." Julian nodded. "She's got presence already." Rebecca, silent for a beat, surprised even herself when she said, "She's beautiful." So much hope in one tiny face. It was the first time her voice held nothing sharp, just truth. Walter looked up, his eyes kind. "Progress isn't linear, but it matters." The words didn't hit like a speech. They landed like wisdom passed down on a porch swing. Simple, unpolished, true. The moment lingered. Then Tiana, ever the thread puller, asked, "Do you have grandchildren, Ms. Langford?" Rebecca blinked, as if the question had snuck past her armor. "Yes, one daughter, Katie. She's a social worker in Chicago, focuses on youth trauma and family care." Julian, curious now, tilted his head. "What's her name again?" "Katie Langford," Rebecca replied. "She works at Southside Family Services." There was a beat. Then Tiana's face lit up, the kind of expression that can't be faked. "Katie? My partner volunteers there every weekend. David Mercer, tall, shaved head, always in those loud neon sneakers." Rebecca laughed. Actually laughed. Not a forced sound, but real, from her chest. "Oh goodness, she talks about him all the time, calls him the sneaker therapist." That was the moment. The pivot. A hush fell over their row, not uncomfortable, but full. Rebecca's hand, still resting on her handbag, relaxed its grip. Her gaze fell again on Walter's phone, where baby Sophia still smiled back. Her voice dropped to something quieter. Maybe I do need to examine my assumptions." She didn't look at anyone when she said it. She wasn't trying to perform. It wasn't for credit or points. It was what you say when you're finally listening to yourself. Julian didn't respond with applause or affirmation. He simply closed his book and offered her a soft nod. One human seeing another. Tiana leaned back in her seat, her smile small but present. She didn't push, didn't explain. She just let the connection speak. Walter took his seat in the open row behind them, but not before patting Julian on the shoulder and whispering, "Takes time, but it's happening." And it was. Not in a sweeping, dramatic way, but in quiet layers. A woman who started the flight demanding her comfort at someone else's expense had just admitted, out loud, that maybe, just maybe, she didn't know everything. For the passengers of Flight 3276, it was a silent turning point. For Julian and Tiana, it was validation. And for Rebecca Langford, it was the first crack of light into a space she hadn't even realized was dark. Somewhere above the Appalachian Mountains, the plane hummed along in a steady rhythm. The cabin lights glowed in soft gold, the clink of plastic cups and murmurs of small talk fading into a sleepy calm. But row 16 still carried a quiet storm. The energy between Julian, Tiana, and Rebecca had shifted, but not entirely. Something unresolved lingered in the air, like static waiting to spark. Rebecca stared straight ahead, then shifted her gaze toward the front of the cabin. Linda was pouring ginger ale for a passenger in row 4, her movements quick and polished, her smile mechanical. Rebecca turned toward Tiana and Julian. "She didn't mean harm, you know," she said softly, as if she knew she was inviting tension. "Linda's always been efficient." Julian looked up from his book, his face unreadable. Tiana's expression tightened immediately. "Efficient isn't the word I'd use for someone who slapped a child," Tiana said. Her voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the steel in it. Rebecca flinched a little. She lost her temper, but I don't think she's a racist. That's a strong word. Tiana didn't blink. Intent isn't impact. People don't have to hate to hurt. They just have to ignore. The words hung in the air like smoke, the kind that made your throat itch. Rebecca pulled her cardigan tighter. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Then she tried again. "I'm trying to have a conversation," she said, her voice rising. "Not be lectured. You sound like a professor." Detached, judgmental. The row behind them fell quiet. Even the rustle of snack wrappers stopped. It was the kind of moment that made people look without looking. Julian reached over and placed a hand on Tiana's arm, not as a silencer but as a reminder. Steady. Tiana's breath caught. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears, not from Rebecca's accusation, but from the exhaustion of always having to explain pain to someone who didn't feel it. She turned slightly in her seat, faced Rebecca full on, and spoke with a voice that trembled, but never cracked. "You're right. Real-world change requires real-world tone, and I still haven't mastered that." Rebecca didn't speak. She didn't move. But something in her face shifted. A softening, a slow crumble of walls too long held up. In that pause, there was no rebuttal, no justification, just silence. And in silence, truth can stretch out and breathe. Julian looked between the two women, his hand still resting on Tiana's arm. His presence didn't demand attention, but it offered anchoring, a quiet force that kept the space from falling apart. After a long beat, Rebecca said, her voice quieter now, "You remind me of my daughter. She says things like that." Tiana smiled, but it was small and tired. "She sounds like someone I'd get along with." "She's always been passionate about helping people," Rebecca added, "especially kids who've been overlooked." Tiana nodded. "That takes heart." Rebecca looked down at her lap. Her hands were clasped, thumbs worrying one another. "You know, when I first got on this flight, I was angry. My husband and I had a fight this morning. Stupid, really, but I carried it with me. I wasn't my best self." Julian closed his book and placed it in the seat pocket in front of him. "We all have moments like that, but what we do after, that's what counts." Rebecca glanced at him and offered a shaky nod. "You and your sister? You've handled all of this with grace. I can't say I'd have found in your position." Tiana chuckled softly, a sound of fatigue mixed with understanding. "Grace gets heavier, the more you're forced to carry it." For the first time, Rebecca didn't look away. "I want to be better," she said. "I do." Julian nodded again, gently this time. "Then you're already on your way." And just like that, the tightness in row 16 loosened. Not entirely, not perfectly, but something real had shifted. For the first time since takeoff, the three of them sat not just beside one another, but with one another. Behind them, the engines hummed on. Time ticked forward. Outside the window, clouds gave way to patches of blue sky, and inside the plane, without fanfare or applause, peace began to take root. Not as an ending, but as a fragile, hopeful beginning. The plane dipped slightly as the cabin lights dimmed for landing, casting a soft glow across the faces of passengers who had witnessed more than they expected on this ordinary flight. The air inside had shifted since takeoff, and while no one spoke it aloud, everyone felt it. Row 16, once tense with confrontation, now sat in quiet reflection. Rebecca kept her eyes forward, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Julian sat calm, his shoulders relaxed but alert, while Tiana leaned back with a steadiness that came only from having faced the storm and stayed standing. Then, a crisp voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Marcus Bennett. Before we begin our final descent into Charlotte, I want to take a moment to speak from the heart. Liberty Airways has always stood for safety, service, and respect, and I want to make it clear that we have zero tolerance for discrimination. Today reminded us all that justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it begins with a single voice." For a second, there was silence. Then, from somewhere near the front, a single clap. Another followed, and soon the cabin filled with applause. It wasn't raucous, it wasn't forced, it was warm, it was true, and it washed through the plane like a wave. Back by the galley, Linda Morgan stood frozen. She had her arms crossed tightly, lips pressed thin. She didn't look toward row 16. She didn't look anywhere. In that moment, she wasn't the one giving instructions or making passengers move. She was just another face in the crowd, and she knew it. Rebecca sat motionless. Her face had gone pale as the captain's words hung in the air. She didn't clap, she didn't move, but in the depths of her silence, something broke. Not publicly, not with tears, but something deep inside had begun to shift. As the wheels touched down and the aircraft rumbled softly to a stop, the energy in the cabin settled. A strange calm, the kind that comes after confrontation has passed but left its mark. The seatbelt signs chimed off, and people began reaching for bags, stretching limbs, checking phones. But in row 16, no one moved. Julian turned slightly to look out the window. The sunlight streaked across the tarmac in golden angles. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Tiana gave a small smile. She felt it too. They had come for a celebration. They just hadn't expected the battle along the way. At the arrival gate, the automatic doors slid open, and there they were. Their parents. Their father stood tall, his salt and pepper hair catching the light, holding a large sign that read in bold hand-painted letters, "Welcome home, our pride." Beside him, their mother held her arms open, eyes already glistening with tears. The moment Julian and Tiana stepped into view, the hugs were immediate, tight, filled with unspoken gratitude. Behind them, Rebecca lingered. Her steps were slower now. She clutched her bag like a child, holding onto something solid. Then she paused. Her voice, once full of command, came out smaller. "Julian, Tiana, I wanted to say, I'm sorry, not just about the seat, about everything. I didn't realize how blind I'd been." Tiana nodded, not coldly, but not warmly either. There was no need to make it easy. Growth was never easy. Julian looked her in the eye. "We just wanted to sit together, like your husband and you, that's all." Rebecca's lips trembled. She nodded slowly and stepped aside. Just then, a familiar voice called out, "Mind if I crash the party?" Walter McKinley appeared at the edge of the gate area, leaning on his cane, that same wide grin on his face. "Walter," Tiana beamed. "Are you serious? You came?" "Wouldn't miss it," he said. "I figured if you're willing to invite an old troublemaker like me to your family's celebration, the least I can do is bring a toast." The Harris parents smiled as introductions were made. Walter shook hands, offered compliments, shared a few well-timed jokes that made their mother laugh. Later that evening, the Legacy Civic Hall was glowing with soft amber lights. Tables covered in white linen stretched across the room. Framed photographs lined the entrance. 50 years of love, struggle, and legacy. Friends and family gathered in clusters, sharing memories, raising glasses. Tiana, dressed in a sleek green dress, stood beside Julian, who looked proud in a charcoal suit. Their parents sat in two ornate chairs in front of the crowd, holding hands like they had done every day since their wedding in 1975. Walter made his way to the front. When he tapped his glass, the room hushed. "I wasn't supposed to be here today," he began. "But sometimes, life writes better stories than we plan for ourselves. I watched two remarkable young people today stand tall in the face of something ugly. Not with rage, not with bitterness, but with courage and grace." He looked toward Julian and Tiana. "Dignity, like love, doesn't require permission. It just requires courage. And these two, they brought it aboard a plane today and carried it all the way to this room." Applause broke out, full and rich. Julian leaned toward Tiana, his voice low but full of meaning. "Sometimes, it's not about moving forward. It's about holding your seat." Tiana smiled, eyes shining. Somewhere near the back, Rebecca sat quietly. She hadn't planned to stay long, but as she watched the Harris family laugh, dance, and celebrate, she realized something. It wasn't forgiveness she wanted. It was understanding, and that would take time. As the music picked up and people began to dance, Linda Morgan sat alone in the break room of the Liberty Airways crew center. Word had traveled fast. She hadn't been fired, not yet. But the email from corporate had arrived. An internal review, required sensitivity training, possible suspension. She stared at the screen for a long time. Then, quietly, she closed her laptop. For the first time in a long time, she had nothing to say. Back at the Civic Hall, Walter finished his toast and sat down beside Tiana. "You keep doing what you do, Professor," he said. "The world needs more of your kind." Tiana chuckled. "Not everyone agrees." "They will," Walter said. "One person at a time." And as the lights dimmed for a final dance, Julian took his mother's hand. Tiana laughed with her father, and somewhere outside, in a city still learning how to be better, hope felt a little more possible.